Login accepted.
Wow. I'm always intrigued by these little movie clips that people will just smash a keyboard twice and then it says a big green screen, access granted. That never happened to me. Also, I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you for putting me in the big room again. No pressure at all. A Polish friend of mine just told me that not to smile over here because a Polish smile is pretty much like this. Hopefully he is right, so if I'm not smiling, it's not to be impolite, I'm trying to be polite here. But before we actually get started, you know, after this is lunch and you're at a security talk, right? All right. If you know that, then you probably are good, but I need your help with a few things. Because who understands this reference? Who knows of which movie this comes from? Hopefully a few of you, yeah? Who actually knows where this is, like physically? London. Oh, yeah, it's London, but London is big. King's Cross Station. And the reference I want to put in here is that if you look at the movies, platform 9 3/4 is not a thing, right? There is platform 9 and there's platform 10, but if you are there with your cart at the right time, at the right place, and you push the right amount of force to that wall, you magically end up in platform 9 3/4. You know what? That is the same thing with our day-to-day lives in software development. If you look at it, we create things, we demo things, we make sure it looks all solid on my machine, then we ship it to production, and all tests are green, but still, we are creators. We're not so much breakers. And if you look at your own software, it looks solid like that wall, but if you are there at the right pace, with the right tools, at the right time, pushing the right amount of force, I bet there will be something that breaks and somebody can get in and maybe do some harm. Because if you think of how we create software, let me give you a few of my little obvious drawings on and how I think and how I feel that we are currently creating software. Say we have this little tiny proof of concept. It's very scoped. So you and your team build it. In this case, it's a nice little shed and it's obviously great. It works like it should be. It's there. So you're happy, you move it to production, but we all know that if it's a proof of concept or an MVP, there's no such thing, right? Once it's in production, it's there. Because then your manager comes up and says like, hey, can we add this tiny little feature? And you're like, sure, it's actually kind of out of scope, but well, it fits. And you're like, yeah, we can, because the man pays you. And then you know that this runs in production for quite a while. And then your upper level manager comes up to you and says the magical words, from a business perspective, it makes sense to combine this feature with whatever you built because customer experience. And you're like, sure. However, this was not the intention of this thing. The foundation was not built to be bigger than this. But you're like, okay, sure, we need to do this because competition, and you build something on top of something else. And then that goes on and on and on and on because you build things half broken, you build things on top of things, you break things half off, and you end up with a structure like this. And if you don't look around and you see at big institutions like banks and insurance companies, and even, probably not even, but the government as well, most of these functions or most of these software packages are like this, talking to the moon, flying helicopters, and do all sorts of things, while it started out as a tiny little proof of concept. Think about it. Do you dare to live in this building with your family? Do you think this is safe? And I see people laughing, like, why do we think this is okay in software development? Because remember, if we push at the right point, with the right tools, with the right amount of force, things will break. My name is Brian Vermeer. I work as a staff developer advocate for Sneak, which means I program a little and email a lot. I'm a Java champion, do stuff in the community, but that is totally not important because we're going to talk about some secure coding essentials. And hopefully, most of these things are already like, duh, I'm already doing this. Then you're in a good spot. But think about it. Is your whole team doing that? Is That new junior that onboards is doing that as well. And are we still doing that if our management pushes the right amount of force on us to deliver as fast as possible? Because apparently we work in an environment where we prioritize features over anything else. So, I need a show of hands. Who of you works with a database? Some sort. Who works with SQL? It's fine. It's fine. You don't have to be afraid of that. It's okay. I'm getting recorded. You're not. It's fine. So, if you work with SQL, you all know, hopefully you know SQL. And what do these two statements mean? Come, yell. Don't be afraid. Yes, the first one is end of statement. The second one is comments. And these are the two things that are very dear to someone who wants to include SQL injection. Because halfway through a SQL string, I can put the semicolon, break it off, put dash dash in, and the rest of the query will not get executed. So let's go into an application. And say I am this new junior developer. Luckily, I have a tool installed, and it says over here, like, Brian, you dumbass, you have a SQL injection problem here. And this is just a Spring Boot application. But it started here at my home controller over to the search repository. So let's take a look at my search repository and actually enlarge this a little bit and see, like, okay, over here, we need to go into, come on. Yes. Work with me. And obviously what we see here is that although I'm using JPA within Spring Boot, for whatever reason, I chose for a native query because I thought it was easier to do a native query if I want to search a product in both the description and the product name. Because back in school, I learned there was an OR in SQL. Okay. Obviously, I put the input, make it to lowercase, and without doing any form of sanitization or validation, I put it here as part of my query string, and put the query string as one thing here to create native query. So, obviously, what can happen is if I demo this, I can use these two things to break in. And hopefully, this is all things that you're like, I know this. But again, in many cases, if you look at the educational systems in many countries, this is not something we actually learn. So I can use something like this, breaking off the query as it is, putting my first parameter in, update product, set price to 0 because I'm based in the Netherlands and I'm a cheapskate, and then put dash dash in so the rest of the query doesn't work. If I submit this and I rerun the coffee shop, you see now I'm a freeloader and I can get everything for free because all prices are now 0. Well, who of you does code reviews? The rest of you does pair programming? Great. At least we probably would catch this in a code review. But isn't that already too late? I mean, code reviews means this already is committed to the branch or to the main branch, and maybe it already spun off something, and if you do continuous delivery, it might already be in production, depending what the pace is you need to move on. Actually, in here, I already found out that with some tooling, and obviously I'm using the tooling from Sneak, but there's more tooling available, doesn't matter what tool you use in my opinion, but I can already catch this during development, and we should. So how should we normally solve this? I mean, if I ask people how to solve this, they come up with either the word prepared statements, if you're a Java developer, or parameterized queries. And I want to say it's actually both, because there's a slight little difference to that. Whoever worked with the great concept of Node.js? Yes, again, I'm getting taped, not you. It's fine. All right, in many things, it's in many applications, like in Java, in most cases, we can create prepared statements. But many people do not know what a prepared statement is. And parameterized queries don't need to essentially be prepared statements. And you're like, what? What do you mean? Well, guess what? A prepared statement, if you look at SQL injection, I already told you, parameter is not sanitized, and you can include it. Yes, in textbooks, you can create prepared statements like this. But what is a prepared statement? Prepared statement is basically a two-way execution. First of all, I create the query with some wildcards in it, and I already offload it to the database. The DBMS, the database management system, in most cases already is equipped to that, and can execute or calculate the execution path. In a second step, I will provide the parameters. And in that case, the execution path is already created, so we cannot interfere with that execution path. And that is what we're actually doing in normal SQL injection. So because it's already handled by the database, we have two things. First of all, it's an optimization for recursive calling the same query, because you can cache the execution path. And secondly, SQL injection like this is pretty impossible. But the code example I showed you was the old school way of connecting to a database, and we probably use frameworks like Spring Boot or Quarkus. Who uses Spring Boot? Yeah, I thought so, a lot of you, right? So how can we arrange this? How should we do this? Are we actually using prepared statements? Because parameterized queries in many JavaScript frameworks just means escaping on the client side and then handing the query over to the other side, to the database, and hope that the escaping was enough. But if you know what the escaping is, you can unescape it in most cases. It's hard, but it's not impossible. Prepared statements is way better execution. But are we using that in Java? Because in this case, I am using a creative native query from JPA. So obviously, if I'm doing it like this, no, I'm not using it. So if I want to use a create native query, I can do something like that. And there are many forms to use this. But say I am doing, let's unescape it. In this case, I have a query text, and I put a parameter here, the question, the question mark 1, and I put in either 1 and 2, I put the lower input. You could put it in both in 1, doesn't matter. The thing is, I now parameterize the queries. But are we using prepared statements? This is JPA. JPA is a reference implementation. What is the default implementation for JPA in Spring Boot? Who says that? Hibernate? Thank you. One person knows. Hibernate. Does Hibernate use parameterized queries and prepared statements by default? In any case, by default. Doesn't matter, it does. So yes, if you're using Hibernate, it does. But in old versions, it can be that there's another implementation. You simply don't know. JPA is a reference. There are 3 or 4 well-known implementations of JPA. Luckily, Hibernate does this for you. So if you use parameterized queries in Hibernate, even with create native queries, then you're using prepared statements. You use that 2-step execution where the execution path is already created before you implement the things. But is this the right way to do it? It depends. Yes, I'm a consultant, you can hear. The other thing you can do, because many of you probably use JPA and then probably say like, hey, we can do other things, right? We can do the overriding or creating an interface ourselves and making sure that we overwrite the JPA repository. Well, that's a good way. I can do exactly the same, but have you seen the name? But for God's sake. Find product by product name containing ignore case or description containing ignore case. Let's put a wrapper around that, please. However, it does work. This means I do not have to do the lower uppercase things, it does it for me, but the convention by naming is sometimes a little bit hard. However, if you use JPA with Hibernate, it does does the prepared statements for you. But if you need to do some more complicated things like join queries or union queries for whatever reason, and you want to create a native query, please go to the search go to here and put your native query in like this. So put wildcards in as I showed you here, and then put the parameters as a second step in to make sure that SQL injection is not possible. And just for the sake of retrying it, because what can go wrong with demos, right? And as you can see here, with the question marks, Hibernate sends basically the query to the database in the first line with question marks, which shows you that it uses prepared statements in the backend. So getting back to my application, hopefully this works. Yes, all the numbers are great again. Let's put in its product, if I'm not mistaken. If I submit this and I try again, obviously all prices are still great. So, you probably know this, right? This is just a starter. Hopefully you do, but guess what? When you're using JPA, first make sure that you check your implementation, depending on where you run the stuff. use your JPI repositories as they are. Yes, the names might be awful, but you can just run a wrapper around that. That's fine. They will take care of it for yourself, and if not, use the native queries with named parameters. But guess what? If your junior comes back from just from university, probably has no clue what SQL injection is, do they do this at the same pace? Probably not. So if we can catch this early in the system, that will be amazing. Next one. SQL injection was obvious, but let's talk about file uploads. And with file uploads, I mean, say we have a screen like this, I want to upload a file in this case, a Spring Boot application with time leave. What happens? Well, let me show you. It looks something like this, but actually, let me show you in code and demo it to you. So I still have this application, and as part of this application, again, I scanned it, and it says to me like, Brian, you've got a path reversal issue in your upload part. So let's go to the path reversal. Let's go to my upload controller, line 32, and let's see what the code actually holds. So this is basically my upload controller. And what I'm doing here, if I have a Spring Boot application, I push the button, and this is just copy-pasted from tutorials with a little bit of shifting. But the file comes in here as a multipart file. What I'm doing here, I want to preserve the original file name, so I replace the spaces with underscores. Okay? And then I'm using the upload directory and using the original file name. The upload directory, as you can see here, is /upload. So why the path reversal problem? Well, what if my multipart file name, what is that? Multipart file is nothing more than a POJO, a plain old Java project, or plain old Java object, a representation of the post request, the raw post request that comes into your system. Guess what? What if the name of this image is not just hello.jpg, but something like //etc/passwd. What happens then? Then you go to the upload folder, you traverse back to the root, then you go into the /passwd folder, and you overwrite the passwd file with whatever is the binary in that post request. This depends obviously on what kind of user is running this Java application. Trick question. What is the default user for a Docker image? Root, exactly. So check your Docker files just in case. Anyway, it's pretty easy to do this. So to do this, in this case, I am starting Burp Suite. Burp Suite is a small little tool used by people that love to do capture the flag situations. And what I'm doing here, it's a free tool. I'm going to the proxy. I open a browser that's connected to that proxy, in this case Chromium, and go to my localhost 8082. Fine. Login, password, user, password, URE. I won't tell you the last character. I work at a security company. It's perfectly safe. So I'm logged in. And my profile over here, I can upload an image. Choose an image. Choose this ugly fellow. Open it and upload. So, okay, back in my profile, you will now see there's a picture. Great. But I used the proxy for a reason. Let's go into the proxy history, and I will enlarge it in a second. And what we see here is that this is the post request of that upload image, right? So let's get it. We get the post request and we get the response. Let's copy the post request to my repeater tool that is in here, and I can play with it. So what we can see here, on the top we have a bunch of headers. On the bottom we have a bunch of red stuff, which basically is the binary, or what's describes the picture. The binary can be anything, basically. But what is interesting is if you look here, that part of the data, the metadata, is the file name. So why not do something like this? So I can actually find it, because I'm very elite, and send it. And we'll see that we have an HTTP 200 response over here. And if I go back to my application, you will now see that it's not part of my upload folder where my Brian 500 JPEG is, But you will see that over here, I broke out of the upload folder and just one level lower. Depending on what kind of user you run this in, it's very easy to break out of the application scope and go into your operating system and overwrite something else. The difference is that if that happens, you don't know how your application responds. Your application is still running, but maybe it responds differently. Maybe you overwrote something like a property file that it now connects to something else. You don't know, and it's actually something you don't want. So what should you have been doing? Well, if you look at one of the options, maybe it gives me an option. Here. What I can do, and this is an option from an open source database, like, hey, how should you do something like this? If you have the path, maybe we should normalize it. And if you normalize it, check if it starts with the destination path, /upload. And if not, throw an exception. That's one of the ways to do it. The other way is obviously to not choose the original file name and use something else. But guess what? Again, I didn't know that this could happen until my scanner basically told it to me, and then I started to reverse engineer it to see, like, how can I hack it? This is actually, honestly, a problem I found out later when I was actually creating something. So, again, does everybody on your team know this? How do you do code reviews? Is it like, hey, Junior on my team, you've got 20 minutes before this needs to go to production. I worked on this feature for 3 weeks. Go! And now, at least 2 people looked at it and we are compliant, right? This can bite you in the butt. So as you can see, it is pretty obvious, but it's also pretty easy if you have the right tooling. And guess what? People that want to break in obviously have the right tooling. So, what is the file name and where does it traverse to? What if you have dot slashes? Where does it traverse back to? Can I break out of the system boundaries? Can I break into the operating system and override something else? Next one. Who still has to work with XML? I do as well. Hopefully, I still think XML is way more obvious than YAML, but let's not get into that discussion. In a lot of systems, apparently in systems with that have connections with bank, insurance companies, and the government, there are still old-fashioned business-to-business couplings with XML. So, what can we do with XML? One of the features in XML are external entity and doc type definitions. And doc type definitions, or better known as DTDs, where they're basically to check your XML format if the incoming XML is something you expected, if it's according to a standard that you have, or according to a contract that you have discussed with the sender. But external entities and doc type definitions are pretty nice to mess with. The thing is, in most Java marshallers, or in most Java XML, how do you say it, deserializers, because we deserialize it to an object and then get it back to, and then work with it. XML external entities and doc type definitions are actually, by default, available. Guess what you can do with that? So, let me run this application again. And what I can do in this application, I can, obviously, if I again log in with my user, oh, now I told it the password, gosh. And I have my orders, I can export it to XML. Well, if I export it to XML, you will see it end up here, but I already have a small example for you that shows you how my XML should look like. So in a normal way, my XML looks something like this. Hey, I have an order, it has an ID, a quantity, a product name, and a price. Nothing specific. And this perfectly works, because if I'm trying to import this XML, where did I put this? Examples, my export file, and I submit this, you will see now I have more than I had before. Great. But guess what? By default, and I'm using an XML marshaller, I think I'm using the SAX parser. Let me check. Probably my scanner already blames me for here doing some crazy crap. Here, XML external entity injection in my XML to order parser. Great. I'm using the SAX parser, which is just delivered to you by the JDK. What can I do, because external entities by default are on and doc type definitions are well, I can do something like this. So I am using a doc type definition here to connect to an external entity, And in this case, it's not a DTD file, but it is the body of my /etc/wd file. So outside of the border of my application. I bind this to a variable called xxe, and I now put it in the product name to see if it works. So if I do this, and I import the other one, you will now see that this is the body of my @c/-wd file. This means I can disclose information that is outside the border of my application. I can disclose information that is part of my operating system, or even worse. Meaning that if people can do this, and they're fast enough, and they grab this and do all sorts of things with it, this is something like, even though they can only read it, it's already a step forward into what is their step in their next attack. As something that you don't want. So by default, you should say, this should be off. This is an insecure default. Unfortunately, in all XML parsers that are delivered to you by the JDK, this is by default on. This is possible. So the things that you need to do if you don't want this, and you don't know if you don't check for it if the XML is coming in, you need to do that yourself. So let's go back to my XML order parser, and what I can do, and obviously I already put it in comments because I'm not good at live coding that well. I just pretend. I mean, for live coding, you should be at Josh's session. Hey, Josh. So what we can do here, if I have the SAX parser, and I say to the parser, get XML reader, set feature, disallow doc type. Set that to true. It's a feature. That's like saying a bug is a feature, in my opinion. But hey, why? External general entities, you should set them to false. And if I do it like this, this is not possible anymore. And you will probably, most certainly, get an error on this. So be aware that in most cases, depending if it's Java or C# or whatever thing, this is considered one of the features in the specs of XML. But should it be by default on in a parser? My opinion, it's not. But you should know. So what are the defaults of your XML parser, YAML parser, JSON parser, or any other stuff that you get in from a secondary or a third party into your system? Check it. All right. Yes, we covered this. I've got 20 minutes left. Let's not go to front end because JavaScript, whatever. Let's skip this. Cross-site scripting. Gosh, why? If I have time, I will have it. Who knows anything about hashing and encryption? A few. Who knows the difference between hashing and encryption? Okay. If you don't know the difference, it's very clear. There's one question you have to ask. Do I need to retrieve the original data? Yes or no? Obviously, for a password, you don't. Because if I have the hash, and when somebody logs in and the password produces the same hash, I just compare the hashes and I don't need to know the original password, right? If you go to a system and say retrieve password and it actually retrieves your password, you should be scared. Either it stores it as plain text, or it's actually using encryption, but that means the database administrator can also look at your password. So again, you shouldn't reuse passwords, but we all know we do. So for passwords, no. Okay, but say we're using hashing, we need to use hashing. What kind of hashing algorithm should I currently use if I do it myself? Hopefully you're not, and you're offloading this to a service. But if you need to do this yourself in your system because, I don't know, I work at a bank and I'm not allowed to go into a cloud vendor that does it for me. What is currently the best algorithm? Almost. Sorry, again? Argon 2 ID. According to some white papers, including what the OWASP guys found out, Argon 2 ID, Argon 2 is actually an award-winning hashing algorithm, but Argon 2 ID is there are multiple versions of it. And Argon 2 ID is the crossroad between Argon 2I and Argon 2D, and it basically has the best implementation or the best trade-off between GPU attacks and side channel attacks. We don't need to go into there, but the problem is not only which algorithm, but what are currently the standards for what kind of, how many memory should I use, how many iterations should I use, how many parallelization should I use? Hey gosh, I'm an engineer, I'm not a cryptographer. But these are things we need to take care of because we probably implement this once, shove it to production, and never touch it again. Because if I look, for instance, in my application here, and it is still used by a lot of folks, I am using, wait, where's my security config? I'm using PBKDF2, which was great 10 years ago. So updating this is something that I can do. And obviously in Spring it's easy. You can just put a new password encoder in and make sure that it now uses the new password encoder. For Argon 2 ID, you need to implement an implementation. You need to have a dependency to the implementation. Bouncy Castle is a great way to do it. But also think about how you should connect to this, because if somebody needs to upgrade their passwords, and there are great solutions in most frameworks, but you need to think of that on forehand. Like, hey, okay, we need to update to a newer password encoder, or actually encoder is the wrong word, it's a hashing algorithm. But let's not get into the semantics. What should we do now? How should we get into this? Specifically, if it's an old system that has been already there for years, we need to update this every once in a while. So check with your team what is currently the right way to do it, how to update, but also how to update not only the algorithm, but what kind of memory frameworks, what my memory sets should I use to stay up to speed in these kind of things. So if I want to use, instead of PBKDF2, I just change this encoder out to Argon 2 ID with the right parameters. Because my internet is a little bit slow, I'm not doing that, because then it tries to download Bouncy Castle. But you get what I'm saying. Thing is, in a lot of companies, if you look at what kind of password encoder or password hasher they're using, it's outdated. And we do take care of our security, but whatever. It's there, it's in production, runs on my machine, fine, leave it. But okay. Oh, I wrote a blog around that. Cool. What about encryption? If we need to do encryption, say, credit card details, because we need to return that to make a new purchase. Let's keep it to semantic encryption, or to how do you call it? Symmetric encryption. Currently, the best way is to use AES, the Advanced Encryption Standard. But again, what kind of key should I use? What kind of mode should I use? You don't have to go into what exactly the same modes are, but different modes of this algorithm are. Some of them are safe because they're authenticated, and some are unauthenticated, which the authenticated methods make sure that it guarantees integrity, authenticity, and confidentiality. But this is hard because I don't know which one we should use, so we should do research on that. Luckily, again, over here it says to me like, hey, you're using broken or risky cryptographic algorithm, because if you look at my current algorithm that I'm using the old DES algorithm on ECB mode. So to get that right in front of my face when I'm developing on this is already for me a heads up that I can catch this early, and if I break it here, I can fix it before it hits my main branch and maybe my CI pipeline. So these are things, again, you need to take care of them, but also in the beginning when you're actually, who of you is an architect? Hopefully you think about these things on forehand, because if you need to switch out algorithms, what do you do? Do you decrypt everything? Do you encrypt everything? Do you do that in a batch job? Do you keep everything offline so people cannot check it? Things you need to take care of, and this depends on the use case of your system, obviously. But we need to update these algorithms every once in a while. Not saying every day, but say, if you now do it on a 6-month or a yearly, annual basis to check what kind of algorithms are currently the best state and what kind of memory footprint you should use, you're probably spot on. Yes, blog posts. We talked about XML. Who likes YAML? Thank God. You should talk to Bruno. Bruno Borges from Microsoft, he loves to rant about YAML, but let's not get into that. YAML is basically yet another markup language. So what we can do with XML, we can do with YAML as well. And hopefully, we do that. But who of you still on an old version of Spring Boot? Spring Boot 2 or something? Yeah, I know Josh is here, but you can put your hands up if you... a few. Well, the thing is, then in that case, you probably are still using SnakeYAML 1.x. And SnakeYAML is, I think, the most famous library that does marshalling for you. And if you just use it for your application of properties, it's pretty much not a thing. But if you are accepting YAML from other sources, and you do it in the way that most tutorials claim how you should do it, With SnakeYAML 1.x, you have a deserialization issue. Because in most cases, it's like this. YAML.YAML is new YAML. My object is YAML.load input stream. Done. Under the cover, what it does, and who knows anything about deserialization in Java? For those who don't, I did a talk last year about that, so watch that if you want to have some more deep dive on it. But basically, that input stream comes into your system, and it's transposed to object, which is great, but if once you load it into memory, it can already set off things. If it's a gadget, for instance, that once it is in your memory, it can already, for instance, I don't know, do a side effect like run something or call something or do something else. If that is the case, then you try to cast it to, in this case, my object, and you will get a class cast exception. But because the thing is already in memory, the harm is already done. And then you're like, sure, but how does it work with YAML? Well, this is valid YAML for SnakeYAML. What? Well, let me go back. In my application, I can export to YAML, right? YAML file comes back, but because it now has all sorts of crap in it, let me see how normally YAML works. So this is a good way of YAML, and this is accepted by SnakeYAML in the old version. ID, order date, order lines, blah, blah, blah. I can, let's call it an annotation. I can annotate it into what object this needs to be transposed to. That is great. But it can be any object if it is in memory. So if you have something in memory that can be misused, I can put something else in it. In this case, I created my own gadget, and my gadget over here, I'm just loading my workshop, coffee shop gadget, and that gadget can contain a string, which is nothing more than a runnable. And obviously what I did was, if you load this into memory, even though you're expecting an order, it now sets off something else. Okay, you probably don't have this gadget.gadget thing in your application. Hopefully not. But do you know which classes are in your application? If you consider all the libraries and frameworks you load into memory, there probably is an object there that can be reached by a chain of events. And we call it a gadget chain. We just need one starter, connect a few objects to each other, and then one sync, and then this might be possible. One of these things is obviously if you use an older version of Java, the script engine, because it's there. If you're using Java, I think it was below Java 9, below Java 10, the script engine was still there, and you could just simply insert this into your YAML, and it will get loaded, and it will actually connect to an outside URL. Or even worse, use a JDBC row set, and then use an LDAP request. And if you probably have been here since 2021, this was also the main problem to do LDAP requests with log4shell, remember? So to do this, and now I basically fabricated the gadget over here, but if I'm just importing this weird YAML file, what is it? Gadget.yaml. And I submit it, I will get an exception. But you will see as a side effect, and the exception is a class cast exception, as you can see here. But as a side effect, it already spun up my calculator. Which means that if we're not inspecting the input stream, we can already get hit before we get the exception. Because of all the classes that are there probably is a path available, and it's just a matter of time before somebody finds it. All right. So how should we solve this? Well, who reads documentation? Exactly, this was in the docs already, all the time. However, if you would ask ChatGPT how to do this, or ask any tutorial, you will get the code I showed you before. But it's not safe to call YAML.load with any data received from an untrusted source. Well, define for me what is untrusted. But if you go to SnakeYAML 2.x, it will be fine. However, this breaks API, so you need to rewrite your stuff if you manually or accept XML like that. Luckily, in newer versions of Spring Boot, SnakeYAML 2.x is the standard. So update your stuff. Yeah, blog post. Okay, lastly, talk about sensitive data. Who of you works with sensitive data? Something with clients, PII data, credit cards, medical data, a lot of you. Guess what? What we see in a lot of things is that people use sensitive data. But because we already talked about how we create proof of concepts, sometimes sensitive data gets leaked. So the question is, what do we output? If I'm going to my application again, you will see I have a tiny little API endpoint with my API controller. And one of the things, I have a get mapping that says get all persons, person service, get all persons. Ah, great. So let's try that. What does it give me? Localhost 8082/API v1 persons. So it will give me all the persons in my system. Great. But what it basically does, because I just scaffold or just use the defaults in this case, it basically marshals my entity, the entity that I have in my database. That is not always the best thing, because now I have an ID, which probably I don't need to output. I have a username, first name, last name, email, encrypted password. Gosh. So we have to watch this from the beginning. And I was in a data breach once where we forgot to exclude a few things, and because an ID was there that could be used in a secondary API call to get more information, that information combined was considered a PAI breach. Oops. It was solved in 2 minutes. 3 actually, because we had to deploy it. However, the aftermath took 3 months. Paperwork and all sorts of crap from my managers. The thing was, I just had to use this @JSON ignore to a certain entity. So if I would use @JSON ignore to say, for instance, my person entity, let's see where my person, domain, order, person, and say I do not want to provide the email. And I could do something like @JSON ignore, which is an annotation that goes to the JSON parser and says like, okay, let's not put string in the JSON output or in the JSON output. And if I reboot this, and I will try this again, you will see that email is now not part of it anymore. So check your entities beforehand if there is data that you never want to get into JSON output, and put these annotations around it. That's one thing. That's not the solution, in my opinion. The solution should be different. The solution, in my case, in my experience, should be that we create, well, I call it a DTO, a data transfer object, in between. So do not output the entities as they were, but make a little layer in between that either combines objects or strips away all the unnecessary information. So say I want to have a specific user output in my API, which just has the first name, last name, and email. Please create an output object and output that simple object from your API instead of the entity. But we all saw in the beginning how we go from proof of concept to full-blown dodgy kind of monoliths. In many cases, this is how we work, and we just forgot. So I would say do 2 things. Put the JSON ignore things on the entity parts that you don't want to deserialize and you don't want to get out, because even though your front end might not use it, if somebody just does a Postman request like that, they will get it anyway. And next to that, try for every endpoint, try to make a specific object that will represent the output, so you cannot forget to do that. Next to that, if you create an entity and you extend that entity with new data, it will not get automatically output in your API. Yes, you need to do that yourself, but that's a safety concern. All right. Oh yeah, blog post. Anyway, how should we get started? Like, there's a lot of stuff that is going on. Well, first thing I would say, how we get started is, if you're still on an old version of a framework or an old version of certain libraries, have any of you heard of Open Rewrite? Great. What we can do with Open Rewrite is, let's start with making sure that all my dependencies and my frameworks are up to date. Yes, I know some people cannot, but it's not that hard anymore. So if I go to Open Rewrite and say I want a recipe for Spring Boot 3, and hopefully my internet is working. It's not. Yay. Oh gosh. Open Rewrite examples. Well, it's not helping me. But take a look at the open rewrite recipes and what you can do with just a simple Maven command. You don't even need to install Maven or Gradle. You can basically load a recipe and update from a 2.x to a 3.x version of Spring Boot in this case, or any framework that is available, and it will do all the things for you. So moving from Java X to Jakarta X, making all these code changes for you in just one go, and it probably and most certainly will not break your application, because these recipes are written in such a way that you can do that. Once you've done that, then, and you're up to date, scan your application like I did here in my IDE, and now I'm using my IDE, but you can use it as a CLI tool or whatever, and see what kind of issues are still there in your libraries. Apparently, because this is a demo application, it has a lot, like the arbitrary code execution in SnakeYAML, for instance. And if you solve that, go to your code and see what kind of problems are there. Like I've got cross-site scripting issues here, and these are, again, very obvious for demo reasons. But over here it says a cross-site scripting issue, which is a reflective cross-site scripting issue because it comes from this input. But it also says I have a cross-site scripting issue here, and we call this a stored cross-site scripting issue because if somebody attacks your database and you just assume that everything in your database is fine, it can be thrown back at you in your system. So some of these things you might find, some of these things you might not find. And even code reviews will help you, probably things in your IDE or on your local system by scanning them and having these tools available will not solve everything, but it will already help you to get to a better level. Especially if we're in that mindset of creating and fixing issues that are functional. Because if we look at our Jira boards, it's probably, hey, as a product manager, if I click on X, I want it to do Y. Security is implicit. So we probably use tooling for linting or for code quality, but also use a tool that helps you from the get-go with finding security issues in your code that you either copied from ChatGPT, Copilot, or Stack Overflow, or maybe you did it yourself, but that relieves you of that burden of finding all of these things in code reviews. So code reviews is still good. Please don't get it the wrong way. Please still do it, but use tooling in between to catch this early and often in every part of the lifecycle of your application. This is what I had to talk about today. All the tooling I used is freely available. Obviously, you don't have to use my tooling. If you use any other tooling, I will already be grateful because it's about the mindset of making sure that we already catch this from the beginning. If you want to connect with me, these are my details. Twitter, because I refuse to call it X, and LinkedIn. Hope this was useful. Thank you so much. We have 2 minutes left, which means you can go early to lunch, and if you have a question, come up to me. I think that is the fair thing to do, right? Thank you.